go.
Hannah's sweater finally came.
Oh, good. Not that she's exactly cold at the moment, but
Yeah, right. But it came via, I think, camel. Okay.
all right, got that open. Just give it a minute for more people to log in, and then we'll start. And there's another.
As soon as you explain the political number of these.
There's a difference between explaining and having everybody understand. I can describe the basic system, and I'm going to, but whether that explains the current situation in Israeli politics, I don't think anyone can actually manage that.
Do you know
What's
there's
that?
an old joke, I don't know if you know this joke, about when Meir, a joke about when Golda Meir met Lyndon Johnson, President Lyndon Johnson. And
Right.
Lyndon Johnson said, I'm the president of 250 million people. And he looked at her and she said, I'm the president of 3 million presidents.
Yep.
You get
There is a unique challenge of being a political leader in Israel.
Hello, Rabbi.
Joseph,
Yeah.
how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are yourself?
Doing fine.
I bet you're looking forward to your vacations next week.
Well, I mean, it's actually the week after next, but it would be more exciting if circumstances were a little different.
Of course, I know that it's going to be now a challenge to go on a vacation, especially if you're used to traveling. It's going to be extra challenging nowadays.
Well, it'll still be nice to have time with the family and kids and all of that. But yeah, we are definitely not planning to be heading out anywhere more than just, for a drive here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Checking the clock, seeing how many more people are here.
Just good.
I'll
be right back. I'm going to look for my glasses.
Just a second. I realize I forgot the come on, mouse. Show me what I want. Let's move that over there. That way I can grab. Excuse me. Just wanted to grab the link for the handout. There and there. Obviously, everything will be on the screen, but for people who like to have their own copy in the PDF, come on. There we go. Too many different buttons. All right. Well, I think we've given a nice little buffer. So it is time to go ahead and get the discussion underway. So this week we are talking about Medinat Yisrael, the modern state of Israel. Obviously, as we talked about in our last session before Shavuot, Israel has had a Jewish presence for, well, almost ever, 3,000-ish years. And the modern state of Israel, however, is a modern phenomenon. We talked last session about what led to the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948. That was a nice place to break. We are now going to cover some of the events and the current situation in Israel from 1948 till now. So that is our framework. If you haven't already seen the section about before 1948, it's okay. I'll make reference to a few things you need to know, but you can pick it up here and you won't be completely lost. Don't worry. So let's go ahead and get things underway. We talked about in the last session that although there had been a Jewish population in the land, the territory of Israel for 3,000-ish years, it had not been growing for a long, long time due to much of the oppression, the persecution, as well as just the general decline of the land under different foreign rulers and occupiers. The Jews who lived there were holding on; they were scraping by, but they were not thriving as massive new communities. They were not expanding the way Jewish communities in other parts of the world were doing. Which meant that when Israel was founded in 1948, most of the people who were founding it were either they themselves first-generation immigrants or the sons and in some cases grandchildren of those immigrants. But there was a huge number of new people to the land. As we also talked about in our last session, before 1948, the vast majority of those people were from European countries. Heavily tilted towards Eastern Europe, where the persecution was worse. But the major population that had been moving in and building up the number of Jews in the land of Israel came from European stock. But you may be wondering, but those aren't the only Jews in the world. What were the other Jews doing? We talked about a little bit in other cases and other classes about the idea of an Ashkenazic type of Judaism, which comes from the European groups, and the Sephardic and Mizrachi communities, which are found throughout North Africa and what is now called the Middle East. What were they doing during this time period? Well, by and large, most of them were not flocking to the Aliyah program. They were not moving towards Israel before 1948. They weren't exactly comfortable in the Arab countries and in the Muslim lands, but it wasn't the same level of persecution that was found in Europe. So they were not finding the impetus to leave from those states before 1948. Much like most American Jews before 1948 also were not leaving America to go to Israel. There were definitely many, but it wasn't a lot. And that was, again, because most Jews in America felt that there was an ability to make a life in America. It wasn't needed as a place to find refuge and hope because we were doing okay in this country. After 1948, that changes. 1948, as we talked about in the last class, there was the War for Independence, and that war left a very bitter flavor in the mouths of the surrounding Arab and more further and broadly Muslim nations. And those Muslim nations began a systematic process of encouraging, of expelling the Jews from their borders. So if we look at our chart here, you can see the numbers of Jews who lived in 1948 in the different countries. And then on the right-hand column, you can see the number of Jews who lived there in 1972, less than 30 years later. So for example, Morocco had 250,000 Jews living in 1948. By 1972, there were only 31,000 Jews left. And if you add up all of the North African and Arab countries, there were approximately 758,000 Jews living throughout those territories in 1948. And by the time 1972 rolled around, there were fewer than 45,000 Jews left in those territories, because those countries, their governments, had begun programs to strip Jews of their status, their wealth, their livelihood, and their lives to such an extent that most of them fled the country. And so you ended up with a diaspora from these countries of approximately 700,000 Jews. And if you go further afield to the non-Arab, but still primarily Muslim countries, you can see as well that an additional 100,000 Jews were driven out of those territories. Now, not all of those Jews ended up in Israel, but the vast majority did. Estimates vary depending upon whose records are being looked at, but most people agree that during the early days of Israel's founding, at least within the first 30 years, Israel absorbed somewhere close to 750,000 people who were coming from these Arab and Muslim nations, in addition to the other hundreds of thousands of Jews who were coming from other parts of the world, refugees from Europe, as well as other immigrants who were not refugees, but who wanted to be part of the establishment of Israel. So that meant that this tiny little country that had only just begun was seeing its population balloon by people who were coming in, many of whom had useful skills, but many of those who came from these Arab countries and Muslim countries did not have assets, because many of them were forbidden from taking their assets when they left those lands. Unfortunately, when people talk about international refugee crises, they often forget to mention these 700 to 750,000 Jews who were forcibly evicted from their homes and turned into refugees, and whom Israel had to absorb. It's just one of the many little imbalances in how history is often told. So, as Israel is being founded, it now has this influx of new people who didn't exactly choose to go to Israel. It was often the only choice they had available, and who had not necessarily been the instrumental in founding the state itself, but who now are finding Israel as their home, who are now becoming citizens of the state. And that's going to create a unique dynamic that's going to continue to this day. Before I move on from the chart, anyone have any questions on this? Okay. So in Israel, you now have in the early years in particular, you have this Ashkenazim, the European Jewish groups, and the Sephardim Mizrachi Jews, this North African, Middle Eastern, and etc. area. There was tension between them. Oftentimes, the Ashkenazim said, we were the most active Zionists. We were the ones who did all the work. We were the ones who were lobbying to get Israel built. We were the ones who have these advanced ideas, in quotes, about the economy and about social society, and we are philosophers and poets and all of these things. And they often looked down on the antiquated, the barbaric, as how they considered the Jews coming from the Middle Eastern countries. They said, what are these people doing? They're showing up. Some of them have multiple wives, which, yes, is technically legal under Judaism, but not practiced in Europe for 1,000 years. These people are shepherds and paupers, and they don't have university degrees. They are not educated through the ideas of rationalism and the Enlightenment. Remember, the Haskalah was so important to those early Zionist leaders. And this created a great deal of resentment and bitterness between the different groups. There was some that was good-natured, but still offensive in terms of the Ashkenazim European Jews being patronizing to their brothers and sisters from the Mizrachi Sephardic communities. Some of it was downright racist, looking upon them as being somehow lesser, because lo and behold, many of the Sephardim and Mizrachi tended to be a slightly darker skin tone than those who came from Europe. Of course, Judaism does not have a race. Judaism does not have a color palette for what color your skin has to be a good Jew. But that doesn't mean that rude and offensive people of all faiths can't still judge people by colors of skin. It is a very unfortunate and painful part of society, but it's one that has been reflected in Jewish life as well as in other parts of the world. We are not unique in having people who behave this badly, but we also do not get to escape from having people behave that badly. So this creates a tension. Now, for much of the early years of Israel, all the way up until the late 70s, the Ashkenazim continue to dominate Israeli politics. They continue to be the vast majority of the members of Knesset, the vast majority of the prime minister, all of the prime ministers, and to occupy many of the positions of power. And this tension has continued till the modern day. It has softened greatly over the last couple decades, mostly because there have been many more families that now have members that come from these different communities. And so there has been more blending, and that has helped reconcile a great deal. The Sephardic and Mizrachi Jews now have equal political power in almost all respects. So that has definitely helped. But there are still who cling to where their family came from before they left Israel as being somehow indicative of their culture. So there are still Russian Jews and German Jews and Polish Jews, even though many of them have, those Israelis have never actually seen any of those countries. So questions on this before we get down to how things looked in the early days? Okay, so in the early days, Israel was a explicitly socialist country. I know that many people misunderstand what socialism means, and many people think that socialism is another word for communism and all the other issues that go on, especially in the modern American climate, where people often don't discuss using terms they explain or understand. But socialism for the new state of Israel meant that there would be a strong government presence, not only in defense or not only in the overall civil laws of the state, but also in ensuring that the economy would be functioning for the benefit of all of its members. Now, this meant that up to the 1970s, when this all changed, as many as 70% of the population worked either in a government job or depended as a contractor or as a secondary level for government work as part of their employment. The government was a very prominent presence within the overall economy of the state. Now, like I said, in the 80s, this all began to get dismantled in the rise of Likud, which became the new political party that began to get stronger and stronger clout. And Israel is now much closer to a mixed economy of a capitalism at its base, but with a heavy remnant of much of the social safety net that came during this socialist period. So Israel still has universal health care. Israel has very strong pensions for the elderly, although there is often discussion and debate about whether they should be increased. Israel usually has very good child assistance and many other social welfare programs, many of which, to be honest, are more generous than you find in the United States. So although Israel is now a predominantly capitalist country, it still has a strong legacy from this socialist beginning. Any questions on the political economy before we press on?
What do you mean when you say capitalist?
So capitalist in political economy terms means that the vast percentage of the means of production of companies and industries, shops and businesses are owned by private citizens and run by private citizens. Israel still has strong regulations and strong laws about what you can do with your businesses. It's not like you can just do whatever you feel like, but the means of production are predominantly owned by private citizens. So you don't see, for example, 70% of the population dependent upon the government directly or secondarily for their paycheck. Right. So instead, the different factories, the different businesses, the different actors in the economy are predominantly private at this point. All right.
I think I appreciate it.
Not at all. Okay, got it. Come on, where's my, there we go. So the other thing to understand how Israel works is their government system. So it's changed a lot. Israel does not have a formal constitution the way the United States does. And it doesn't even have a strong informal constitution the way something like the United Kingdom does. Instead, Israel will often change the way they organize their government. There has always been a Knesset. A Knesset is the equivalent of their parliament. You would call it our Congress if you were looking for a parallel in America. But sometimes they have a prime minister, and sometimes they have a president with actual authority, and sometimes they have a president with more symbolic authority. So at the moment, you're welcome to study the history of this, but at the moment, Israel has a Knesset with 120 seats. That is, people are elected to that by proportional representation. So unlike America, where you have districts, where you live in a particular area and you elect a representative to go to Washington from that area, Israel does not have that. Israel has a proportional representation, meaning everyone in the whole country votes, and then they divide 120, roughly, by the percentage of votes that a particular political party received. So if one party received 50% of the votes, they would get 60 seats in the Knesset. And it wouldn't matter if that 50% came all from the north, all from the south, all from the east, all from the west. All that matters is what percentage did you get? That's how many seats you get in the Knesset, in the Congress. And what political parties do is they publish a list of all the names of the people that they will send to the Knesset, depending upon what percentage they get. So they have 120 names. No one's going to get 100% of the vote, but they have 120 names. And number one name is going to be the prime minister. That would be the person who would be in charge if they get a majority. It's the leader of that party. And then you move down the hierarchy, and you have to decide how many seats do you think you're going to get before you start just putting names on the list as a joke. Well, not as a joke, usually as part of a political favor. Now, I said if you get 50%, you get 60 seats. Nobody gets 50%. 30-ish% is about typical for a large party nowadays. And those large parties then have to work together with the smaller parties who receive 11, 9, 2, 3 seats in order to make a coalition of at least 61 seats. And if you have 61 in that coalition, where they all agree who's going to be the prime minister, and they roughly agree about who's going to get which of the different government jobs, and they sort of agree on what the policies will be, then hooray, you have a government. Now, if you've been following Israeli politics at all over the last year, you'll know that it wasn't until May that Israel finally had an official new government after multiple failed elections. The elections were a success, but after each election, they couldn't find a coalition. They couldn't get a majority of people to actually agree who should be prime minister and how the government should be constructed. So Israel went for more than a year without being able to finalize the next step, its next government. The only reason they finally went over and had a majority was because of the COVID pandemic. There were a lot of policies that needed to be put through, and they needed an actual government that would be able to rule with some confidence and actually govern. And so the leader of the main opposition party, Gantz, who had been saying he would never work with Netanyahu, who was the former prime minister, they finally came to an agreement where they would have a power sharing swapping of prime minister. So Netanyahu became prime minister again. He is now the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, but Gantz gets to be prime minister next, unless there's another election. And if there's another election, he may never get his turn. So it is a very complicated, very difficult to understand, and often deeply frustrating system of government, but it does ensure maximum representation of many, many people. And it also ensures overinflation representation of small parties that are able to make that final threshold of a coalition. And it also can mean that some people don't get represented very much at all if people are not willing to be in a coalition. So for example, in this last election, the third largest political party was called the Joint List. And that is a political party made up of people primarily representing the Arab population of Israel. Remember, we talked about in the previous segment, when Israel finally secured its border during the armistice in 1949, they gave the vote to any citizen, any person that was living within the borders of Israel itself. And that meant that there are hundreds of thousands of Arabs who are full citizens, have full rights, and get to vote, and they send representatives to the Knesset. And there are members of the Supreme Court that are also Arab and Muslim. Remember, not all Arabs are Muslim. There are Arabs who are Christian, there are Arabs who are Jews. It depends on how you want to clarify your definition of Arab. So they are represented in many of the different aspects of society, but by and large, the other political parties will not make coalitions with them, because many of the members of the Joint List, or of the smaller Arab parties made up in the Joint List, are quite antithetical. They are quite antagonistic towards the idea of there being a Jewish state in the Middle East. So most of the other political parties do not want to try and form a government with a political party that is sort of opposed to their very existence. And I just see there's a quick question from YouTube, which I was just about ready to get to, about is there different representation based upon different Jewish groups? And the short answer is yes. First of all, there are Jews who are from Russia, and they have overwhelmingly supported a politician named Lieberman, and that has created a bit of a voting bloc within that community. It's not 100%, but it is a large portion of the Russian, recent Russian immigration to Israel supports Lieberman's party. There are also political parties that support ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazic and ultra-Orthodox Sephardic, and some of the non-ultra-Orthodox Sephardim also support that political party known as Shas. Those religious parties do often have outsized influence when it comes time to coalition build, because they are willing to generally work with both left-wing and right-wing governments as long as they can get the authority that they want within their communities. We talked last time about the idea of the status quo within the religious groups, meaning that as long as the government are willing to continue the exemption from the ultra-Orthodox for military service, the generous payments made to their members directed through the ultra-Orthodox religious leaders rather than directly to the people, and are willing to give them the full authority over issues of personal status, marriage, divorce, burial, conversion, adoption. The ultra-Orthodox have generally been willing to be part of any government as long as they are able to get those key issues dealt with the way they want. This has created a long-term and untenable problem in Israel. It is difficult for both their military, their economy, and for social cohesion when there is a sub-portion of the Jewish population that is essentially separate, isolated, and often antagonistic to the main population of the country. All right, so with all of that in mind, now Israel has to deal with warfare. It is hard to imagine how a country could absorb almost 1 million refugees, pull itself up out of a war for its independence and its prior colonial status under the British, under the best of circumstances. But Israel did not get the best of circumstances. Israel was plagued by conflict from 1948 until the present day. Conflict has often flared up, but it's important to remember that in between these dates I'm going to show you of the different wars in Israel, there was still armed conflict. Israel did not get peace treaties until the 1970s, late 70s with Egypt, and then in the 90s with Jordan. And in the meantime, they had armistices. They had official ceasefires, that were often broken by the nations that surrounded Israel. So in 1956, there was a major flare-up where Israel attacks Egypt to regain access to the Suez Canal and the Gulf of Eilat. Now, this was a very controversial move. On the one hand, yes, Egypt had been continually sending armed raiders into Israel all the way back since the beginning of Israel's creation, meaning that you just have to imagine the Canadians sending, their special forces or not so special forces over the border continually for almost a decade, coming into New York or into Montana, murdering people and leaving. And imagine what that would feel like for the Americans and how we would want to respond. But Israel had been doing their best to stop them, but not engaging in open warfare. Nasser, who was the dictator of Egypt at the time, had nationalized the Suez Canal. That meant that the Suez district, which connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and is a major economic lifeline of Europe, was no longer under British control, as it had been. Instead, it was now going to be under Egyptian control. England and France and the rest of Europe was not 100% happy about this. This was also a problem for Israel, because now Israel was being told that any shipments going to Israel or from Israel would not be allowed to go through the Suez Canal. They would have to deviate around the African continent. Obviously, this was not a good situation for Israel. They also had begun to block the Gulf of Eilat, which is at the very, very tip of where Israel opens up into the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. So Israel was being pinched more than they had been in 1956. Nasser, at this time, also began an arms race with Israel, very much staking his ambition to be a pan-Arab uniter around the idea of being the one who would lead the attack, lead the assault, and in his mind, destruction of Israel. He really saw this as being his centerpiece. Now, Israel goes in, Israel fights, Israel takes the Suez. Much of the provocation for this, however, should also be laid at the doorstep of the British and the French. The British and the French secretly were very much encouraging Israel to attack under the guise that if Israel attacked, they would come back to stabilize the canal region and Israel would be able to have access again and they would be able to take it back from Egypt. Unfortunately, 1956 was a presidential election year in America, and Eisenhower decided he did not want this to happen while he was running for re-election, and so he was able to force a quick capitulation, and Israel withdrew to its original borders. Egypt regained control of the Suez, and things continued more or less as they had been before. But Suez is often sort of a forgotten war. It doesn't get as much screen time as the Six-Day War. So the Six-Day War happened in 1967. And I have to remind you that it was not called the Six-Day War when it began. In 1967, no one knew that the war was only going to last 6 days. In fact, most analysts said that Israel was about to either be devastated or lose the war completely. The Arab nations had been continuing their arms race and building up their resources. They, of course, outnumbered the Israelis and the Israeli army by a massive margin. And Israel was now beset on all sides by massing militaries. More than that, however, if you can see this map here of the north of Israel, there were particular problems with for Israelis who lived in the Galilee up in the north, from attacks from Syria on the Golan Heights. As you can see, there is a huge difference in the elevations, and the Syrians, before the war even began, would routinely shoot shells from artillery or mortars into Israel itself. So technically there was an armistice, but the Syrians were constantly attacking and bombarding. If you visit the Galil nowadays, you can still find in many of the kibbutzim, many of the farm communities, the remnants of the damage of the shelters, and what it was like for people who lived during that time of continual bombardment. Down in the south, Egypt was continuing to attack as well, as they had been ever since 1948. And the Arab forces in general had begun to mobilize. Now, part of their mobilization meant that they had formally driven the United Nations peacekeeping troops out of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, the peacekeeping troops were there to prevent any one side from attacking the other. The fact that they were pushed out and told to leave meant that Israel was very much anticipating that there would be an attack. In addition to that, the Straits of Tiran were closed, and that meant that Israel would no longer be able to get oil from its major oil trading partner, Iran. And yes, I know nowadays, if you say that Iran is an ally of Israel, it sounds crazy. But in the middle of the last century, Iran, still under the Shah, who had been put in place by the British and the Americans, much to our discredit, as we had dismantled their own democracy and instead installed a dictatorship that we wanted to be more friendly with us. But it was beneficial to Israel because it meant that Iran would sell their oil to Israel. And so that was Israel's main oil partner. And now with oil being cut off, that was going to put Israel both economically and militarily in a very dangerous position. Jordan and Iraq joined a defense pact. Everything was there to show that there was a war about to happen. So what did Israel do? They attacked first. Right? You can call it a preemptive attack. Technically, there had already been causes for war given because of the different actions taken by Syria and by Egypt. It was not, by international law, Israel had already been attacked, even if they had not seen the armies, the full armies of all of their enemies move across their borders. But people still usually call it a preemptive attack because Israel was the first to strike with a full mobilization against its enemies. And when Israel did so, it did it with overwhelming force and overwhelming success, devastating the air forces of the surrounding nations, and then using its air supremacy as well as its very quick and lightning tank maneuvers to capture massive amounts of terrain and to secure it very, very quickly. And as we'll see from the next map, there we are. When the dust settles, Israel went from being this dark gray shape to including the entire lighter gray shape that you can see. And Israel was pressing in the north towards Damascus and could have continued to move, but instead stopped once it secured the Golan Heights from which it had been attacked. Israel was in a position to press across the Jordan River all the way into the capital of Jordan in Amman, but chose to secure the Jordan River and stop. And Israel was in a position to continue to drive into Egypt. If it had wanted to cross the Suez Canal, it could have gone in and attacked Cairo. Israel did not carry out attacks on any of those capital cities. It did not bomb them or do anything as a form of total war. It was satisfied, if you will, to merely push back and secure its main population areas, as well as to give itself more defensible positions should there be a retaliation. Now, what happens at this point is Israel is now in control of the area called Gaza, often referred to as the Gaza Strip. Israel is now in control of the Sinai Peninsula, and Israel is in control of the area here that is usually referred to as the West Bank, meaning the west bank of the Jordan River. And Israel was now in control of a territory called the Golan Heights. Israel, if you zoomed in on Jerusalem, had also gained the eastern section of Jerusalem, which was, of course, most importantly, the Old City. At this point, because of taking the West Bank and Gaza Strip primarily, plus a few extra people who lived in these other territories, Israel added 750,000 Arabs into its population. However, the population was not absorbed. Israel did not officially annex or claim this territory at that time, and therefore the people who lived in these areas were not given citizenship. Later on, Israel would formally annex the Golan Heights, and the people who lived there were given citizenship if they wished to have it. And you would hope there would be peace, that people would say, wow, Israel is just too tough. We can't do this anymore. But no, the attacks and the terrorism continued after the Six-Day War as well. Any questions or comments before we move on for the next phase? Okay. Roll forward a few years to 1973, and it is Yom Kippur. Now, Yom Kippur, as I think all of you now know, is the day when Jews are most involved in prayer and most involved in our services. And that meant that Israel was not expecting an attack. There had been some false alarms. There had been a number of feints by the Arab countries pretending that they were going to attack Israel and then not. And so Israel was not exactly at its highest state of readiness. And so in 1973, the Arab states finally on Yom Kippur do attack. This is going to be the last full-scale pan-Arab war that Israel has faced. It was also its hardest war, partly because it was caught slightly off guard, partly because the Arabs were now using much better Soviet technology. The Soviets had begun to support the Arab states as part of their proxy war against the United States. So having the Arabs be well armed was considered to be reflecting well on the Soviet Union. And Israel had difficulty coping with the, of course, superior numbers, but now also superior equipment of the Arabs. There had been just a hint of complacency that came after the success of the Six-Day War. There had been just a hint of feeling that they would be able to easily deal with any Arab attack, and that did put them on the wrong foot when the war began in 73. However, Israel does eventually pull itself together. It is able to repel the attacks by the Arab armies, some of it by incredible sheer determination by many of the Israeli units, some of it by very good generalship, some of it by a little bit of luck, and also by poor coordination among the Arab states. But Israel is able to finally stabilize and indeed push back to the full borders that it already had enjoyed in 1967. So not only did the Arab armies not penetrate and destroy Israel itself, but Israel was able to recapture its lost territory from the early days of the war. Again, near the end, what would become the end of the war, as Israel was now very powerful and in a strong position, the world stepped in and said, okay, now we need to have a ceasefire. Now we need to have this war stop. There was a great deal of concern that the Soviet Union might enter directly on the side of the Arab nations, which would then provoke America to enter on the side of Israel, which of course could be a rather explosive situation. So the world finally was able to get a ceasefire in place, and things went back to the generally bad situation that they had been as they had been before. However, things were a little bit different in a way that they hadn't been before. On the one hand, internally, Israel goes through a period in the 70s of soul searching. How could we have had such a almost a defeat? How could we have had such so many people who had been killed and lost in this war? What were we doing? At the same time, just along with the rest of the world that was suffering great inflation and economic difficulties, Israel too was suffering at that time. So the Labor Party, which had had a leadership in the Knesset since 1948, was finally voted out by the country. And Likud, which was a more right-wing party, both right-wing in terms of its international policies as well as its economic policies, came in and began the economic changes we talked about before. Government companies were privatized, currency trading was opened up to allow the shekel to fluctuate more, and there began to be, in the wake of all of this, a large tech boom. Israel got very, very lucky of having many people who were uniquely skilled. Israel still has one of the highest per capita number of engineers and PhDs in the world to take advantage of the new information industrial revolution of people who would be engineers that were on the cutting edge of much of the technology that would begin in the 80s and then really take off in the 90s and early 2000s. So all of this worked together to really give Israel a very powerful economic boost at this time. The other thing that made a huge difference for Israel at this time was that there was a new president, dictator of Egypt called Anwar Sadat, and he decided that his country would be better served if he made peace with Israel. At this time, the Israeli prime minister was Menachem Begin, and under the assistance, more or less, the history is still out exactly on what role President Carter played in this, but certainly he helped facilitate it. In 1978, Sadat and Begin signed what are called the Camp David Accords. This was the first peace treaty that Israel made with one of her Arab neighbors. And there are lots of reasons why Egypt wanted to go into this. It was incredibly expensive for them to continue their militarization to attack Israel. It was becoming less and less popular within their own nation. And the United States was willing to sweeten the deal. The US essentially took Egypt and made it a client state of America rather than a client state of the Soviet Union by offering her billions of dollars a year in aid. And to this day, Egypt is the second largest recipient of American aid. And that is still going back to this peace treaty. Now, this was incredibly important for Israel because Egypt was the main military threat to Israel. Yes, the other nations, Jordan and Syria in particular, had strong militaries and were dangerous. But without Egypt on her southern border, Israel was in a much, much stronger position. And in fact, so strong that the other nations were now no longer willing to attack in a normal, conventional warfare situation. Now, the peace treaty that was signed in 1978 included an additional section for creating peace with the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians were the new nationalist movement for the Arabs who had been living in the territory that would become Israel, both prior to 1948 and afterwards. And when Israel took the West Bank and Gaza Strip in particular, there was an upsurge in nationalist rhetoric among the Arabs who lived in those territories to fight against the Israelis. And that became known as the Palestinian movements. And in the late 70s, Israel said, when they were doing the peace treaty with the Egyptians, that yes, they would also work with the Palestinians to secure a separate state and a peace, negotiated peace with the Palestinians. However, the Palestinians rejected that offer. That is to say, because they had not been invited from the beginning to the Camp David discussion, when the peace treaty was signed with Egypt, including this section that Israel would also make peace with the Palestinians, Israel then turned to the Palestinians and said, okay, now on to part two. And the Palestinians said, no, thank you. If we weren't at part one, we don't want part two. Now, of course, there was an underlying issue that many of the Palestinian leaders, although it's debatable exactly among the rank and file, but certainly among many of the leaders, there is no intention of making a two-state solution with Israel. And so to have continued with the peace negotiation in 78 simply would not have matched their ultimate vision of what they wanted to accomplish, which was the destruction and eradication of Israel entirely. So the other thing that Israel that changed at this point was Israel gave up the Sinai Peninsula, that large triangle shape at the bottom of the map. They also tried to return the Gaza Strip, which is home to many people who are Palestinian, but Egypt said, no, we don't actually want that piece. You're welcome to hold on to that. For all of Egypt's bravery in doing this, Sadat was assassinated. There were many in the Arab world who considered him a traitor for making peace. And because he made this treaty, he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards a short while thereafter. So, as I mentioned, the Palestinian movements began much later as a formal structure than 1948. Yes, there were Arab nationalist movements, as I mentioned last time, that were responding and fighting against the British occupation, but the actual formal identity of the Palestinians came much later. In 1964 was when the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was formally created as part of the Arab League, which is sort of, if you will, the United Nations of the Arab world. Yasser Arafat was the most prominent leader of the PLO for most of its life. He organized more than 61 attacks between September and December 1967, and in September, December 1967. 1968, they begin the process of hijacking, which became a dominant theme in international life between the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. And of course, eventually culminating with the 9/11 attacks. Although those were not officially PLO attackers, they were using many of the same techniques and some of the ideology that had been pioneered at that time. Other terrorist groups were formed in Lebanon, in particular Hezbollah, which became part of the opponents attacking Israel in 1985. We'll get to the Lebanon War in just a second. And then Hamas was formed in 1987 as another Palestinian terrorist organization, primarily because they felt the PLO was not radical enough. They were trying to be stronger, and Hamas also introduced the idea of a Islamic element. The PLO was a secular group and continues to be primarily a secular group to this day, but Hamas and many other groups, as they began to develop in the late 80s and 90s, began to lean more and more strongly towards a radical Islamic philosophy. It is important to remember that the early forms of Palestinian movements were not about religion. They were purely a political and secular idea. So when people say that it's impossible to make peace because they have different religions, they simply don't know their history. And they also don't remember the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of Christians, Muslims, and Jews living peacefully in Israel itself. So there is nothing inherent in the religion that prevents people from having peace. So let's talk a little bit about Lebanon. Lebanon is Israel's northern neighbor, and Lebanon had always been a relatively unusual and somewhat stable country in the far east of the Mediterranean. It was a mixed country, meaning it had many Christians and Muslims living there, but it had managed to maintain itself more or less intact and more or less stable for much of this time period. However, the PLO tries to overthrow the government of Jordan in 1970. You may remember Jordan is, of course, just across the Jordan River. Many of the people who lived in Jordan were people who had left the land of Israel when it was being established because they didn't want to live in the Jewish country. And many of the people who lived there decided they would like to take over Jordan and create their own country. Jordan didn't like this. And so Jordan began an incredibly harsh campaign against the Palestinian leadership in Jordan, massacring hundreds and hundreds of them, and driving them as an organization out of the country. The PLO then relocates to Lebanon. They set up their shop in that country, and they begin to attack Israel from there. And they partly contribute to a civil war that breaks out in Lebanon in 1975. The PLO now doesn't have a government of Lebanon to keep them in check. And so they become more and more aggressive in their attacks across Israel's northern border. So in 1978, Israel invades Lebanon, primarily in the south. In 1982, it flares again, and Israel assaults the PLO in Beirut. This was a very tense and famous time when the United States lost many of our soldiers in Beirut who had gone there as peacekeepers. It was a time of great tragedy all around. The PLO then, with their base in Beirut destroyed, flee to Tunisia. Israel does eventually attack them there as well, but that's a whole nother story. Israel remains as an occupying force in the south of Lebanon until the year 2000 as a means of trying to control its northern border. You can see here the Israeli border with Lebanon, and Israel would station itself mostly up to the Litani River here in the south of Lebanon. And it was there primarily so that any attacks that might come out of Lebanon would hit Lebanon rather than hit Israel itself. As you can see, Israel has numerous communities and villages right up against the border, as you would expect. I grew up in San Diego, which is of course a cross-city border city on the border with Mexico. And if you have a border, you usually build towards the border. And Israel is too small to leave itself a buffer zone of any significant size. So as long as terrorist attacks continued, Israel wanted to try and secure this area to prevent it from being used as a base of operation. But eventually Israel does pull out, as I mentioned, in the year 2000, and they do so unilaterally. That is to say, they have decided that at this point, there is little benefit in remaining. Attacks can come from deeper within Lebanon should the terrorists wish. And so the expense and the difficulty and the human toll is getting too large, so Israel decides to pull back. All right, let's talk about some positive things. Israel is often called Innovation Nation. There's actually a great book by that title that sums up many of her accomplishments in various fields. As I mentioned, it is second in the world in the number of college degrees. As software took off in the 80s, this made it a huge facet. Some of the biggest Intel research plants are in Israel. It is a leader in agricultural, military, medical, robotic, and computer innovation. Israel is usually in the top 2 or 3 countries for filing patents in the United States. And it is ranked 10 by the Bloomberg Innovation Report, at least in 2017, ahead of the UK, ahead of China, ahead of Canada, ahead of France, ahead of Norway. Israel, for all of its tiny little size, punches above its weight when it comes to the creativity of its population. And much of that is, of course, due to the strong push to keep people linked up and together. It is a small enough country that if there's a researcher doing something interesting in the north, you can drive an hour if you're in the south and find out what they're doing and learn from one another. It is a wonderful stew of ideas, and that is a ripe and fertile ground for innovation. However, the entire period has not been 100% nice. There has been different insurrections called the Intifadas. These are uprisings by Palestinian terrorists. Some of these were due to frustrations with the situation. There were also difficulties with the measures that Israel was trying to put in place to curb Palestinian violence. There has been a lot of trouble as the Palestinians have changed many of their tactics. They are less interested in attacking Israel militarily and more interested in causing fear, terror, as well as provoking attacks by Israel that will lead to the death of people that they can claim are innocent bystanders. Some of them indeed are. They often use human shields. Some of them are people who are simply wearing civilian clothes, but are engaging with live fire against the Israelis. But when the Israelis shoot back, when there is an ununiformed person, the uninformed will assume that it was a civilian casualty. And this asymmetrical warfare has become one of the most difficult aspects for Israel in the last 25, 30 years. In 1993, there was an attempt to put together a peace program. Yasser Arafat, you may remember, the terrorist leader of the PLO, was willing to meet with Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister of Israel at the time, and they signed an accord that would put together a framework that would lead, ideally, to a final negotiated peace. The PLO and the Palestinians recognized Israel's right to exist. Israel recognized the Palestinians as legitimate and having political rights. and there was scheduled to be a phased withdrawal of Israeli forces, and they established a Palestinian government. This program was designed to build up confidence and trust until eventually there could be a separate independent Palestinian state, and Israel could also enjoy peace for the first time since 1948. Unfortunately, it hasn't gone quite so well. Israel has had a little more luck with the Jordanians. In 1994, following the peace treaty, not the peace treaty, but the peace accord with the Palestinians, Jordan also was willing to make peace with Israel. This included negotiated water rights. You may remember the Jordanian River is a border between them, and who controls the Jordan is a very important topic. The Jordan water is a very important topic. They cooperate on defense. As you may also remember, the Jordanians have dealt with terrorists within their own borders, and they have generally been willing to work with Israel. And more recently, Israel has been willing to work with them, especially against people like Al-Qaeda, to try and prevent them from getting control of Jordan on Israel's border. Jordan has also retained their status quo role in administering the Muslim sites of Jerusalem. Jordan had annexed the territory, if you remember from last session, that we call the West Bank, and that included the Old City. And at that time, Jordan became the de facto keeper of those holy sites. And to this day, Jordanians are the ones responsible for the Muslim holy sites in the East Jerusalem and in the Old City. I know we're running a bit, but I think I'm already a bit over time. So 2000 to 2005, which is when I lived in Israel, in 2003 and 4, we had the second Intifada, another wave of bombings after an additional attempt to try and create peace. Ariel Sharon was visiting the Temple Mount, and this was used as an excuse for new violence. And many people believe that this was not a spontaneous uprising, but instead a deliberate political ploy to try and force more concessions from Israel for a negotiated peace. Unfortunately, we are not closer to peace now than we were before that, but many more people were killed on both sides. I'm going to wrap it up with this. There is obviously a lot left to talk about. This is just meant to be an aerial view of the situation. There are still outstanding issues for finalizing how this is going to work. Israel is adamant that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. This doesn't mean they have to believe that Judaism is important, but it does mean that the Palestinians will not feel that they have the right to have all of their displaced people to return to Israel itself, meaning the area not including Gaza and the West Bank. It is important also, if you didn't know, Israel formally did remove itself from Gaza and is not in Gaza at all. It defends itself from Gaza, but is not in that territory. But Israel is not willing to entertain the notion of 1 million, 2 million or more people coming into the territory of Israel and reclaiming whatever they believe would be their space and fundamentally altering the balance of Israel. The other outstanding issue, of course, is the control of Jerusalem. Both east and west portions, as we talked about, the new city and the older eastern neighborhoods, plus the holy city itself, the actual site of Jerusalem, the old city, is a major point of contention and disagreement. Exactly how much autonomy and sovereignty any new Palestinian state would have is also very much debated, and how to provide for security in whatever shape an agreement would have. In this last year, there has been a new proposal put forward by the Trump administration, which has made many people both excited as well as anxious as well as angry, because anything you say about the Middle East will cause those emotions. But one of the things that has at this very moment created a great deal of discussion is possible annexation of territory in the West Bank by Israel. This is something that many other countries, not only Arab, but also European, are very much opposed to. Israel is unclear what their current new government is going to do on this topic. There has been much talk about going through with some annexation, but a formal timeline. And you know, it's at this point, it's as I always say about Israeli politics, I believe it when I see it. If you think you can predict Israeli politics, then you might as well go down and buy your lottery ticket, because if you can play those kind of odds and know what's going to happen, you've got the gift. But what will happen, we don't know, right? Will there be another war? Perhaps. Will there be more terrorist attacks? Almost certainly. Will we find peace sometime within the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 years? I don't know. All the ingredients are there to allow for peace if primarily the Palestinians are willing to accept Israel as being their neighbor. Unfortunately, the longer that's been delayed, the more intransigent many Israelis have come to accept the Palestinians as their neighbor. And when you have two people who don't want to be neighbors, it is very hard to get them to stop fighting. But if anything, if Israel has taught us anything, it is that miracles can happen when you least expect them. From the depths of deprivation in the late 1800s to rising to a very powerful economic and cultural state in less than 100 years. Nobody, if you had told them in 1850 that there would be a Jewish state in Israel that was doing as well as it is, nobody would have believed you. And so before we discount the chances of peace or the chance of there being a brighter future for everyone in the region, let's remember that we've already had more than we could have expected, and pray and hope that we will get better in the near future too. Any final questions on this incredibly complicated topic that I have rushed you through? All right, so just a little bit of housekeeping. There is class again next Thursday night, but the following week I will be on vacation. So we have one more class, and then we will be off until July 16th.
Okay.
So if you have outstanding questions or issues that you'd like to get a quick answer on, make sure you send them to me, call, text, email over the next week and a half or 2 weeks. Otherwise, you might have to wait.